Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 2 of the Avalanche Inc. podcast from the Denver Post. My name is Corey Massasak. I'm a beat writer for the Post, covering the Avalanche, who are one of the hottest teams in the NHL right now. My guest this week is Pierre LeBrun of The Athletic and TSN, and we're going to talk to Pierre about the Avalanche Oilers game, which was arguably the best game in the NHL this season. We're going to talk about the GM meetings that are happening right now in Florida, and we're going to hit on sort of a debrief of the trade deadline and all the big moves that happened. So let's talk about the Avalanche from the past week and the week that was. The Avalanche won a lot of games in the past week. They kind of three takeaways from the past week. Number one, obviously, is the new guys. The new guys are good. The Avalanche added 4 players, and all 4 of them have fit in probably about as well as you could have imagined. And I would say normally whenever a team adds 3 or 4 players, it doesn't necessarily always work like this, where the 4 of them all kind of fit in so seamlessly, so quickly. But Casey Mittelstadt has been pretty much everything that he was as advertised, and maybe even a little bit better as the new number 2 center for the Avs. His puck play and the way that he helps the team keep possession, and he's just, obviously the team is. This was the fastest team in the league. I wrote about this last week. This was the fastest team in the NHL before the trade deadline. And maybe the scary thing for the other teams around the league is that they added 4 guys who all individually kind of helped upgrade the overall team speed. And the big question was going to be, how quickly could these guys fit in? And as Jared Bednar has said, there's a difference between skating fast and playing fast. And I think that's been probably the biggest positive from these first few games that the new guys have played, is that it seems like they've been able to play fast and not just be fast. The second thing is, look, the road woes. It's been kind of a common theme all year that the Avalanche would win 1, lose 1, win 2, lose 2 on the road. And they just won 3 games in a row on the road as they swept through Western Canada. That was the first time they've won 3 in a row on the road since the first 3 games of the season. And I don't really think necessarily before Colorado went to Western Canada that the road thing was really that big of a deal. They've been a good road team the past couple of seasons. They've won plenty of big road playoff games. But I think the fact that they went to Vancouver and they went to Edmonton, beat 2 of the 5 or 6 best teams in the NHL probably, the way that they beat both of them, coming back, the big crazy comeback in Vancouver, the giving up the lead in the third period and then still getting it back to overtime and then winning in overtime in Edmonton, there should be no concern I'm pretty sure there wasn't any concern in the locker room. I think probably more of it was probably from outside the locker room, but there probably shouldn't be any concern about whether or not the Colorado Avalanche can win, a key road game in the playoffs in Vancouver or Edmonton or Vegas or Dallas or wherever they end up. I mean, I think that was, Jared Bednar has talked about it a few times about how they wanted to play better on the road, and I think that now that they've done it, I think that's definitely a big kind of checklist, box that's been checked on their checklist of what they wanted to do here during the stretch run of the season. My third takeaway from the week that was is that this might be the best the Colorado Avalanche have played all season. In the past 5 games, they have outshot their opponent by 25, 10, 11, 13, and 9 shots on goal. That's significant because they haven't done anything like that all season. They had one stretch earlier in the year where they had basically 4 or 5 out of 6 that was similar to that, and one bad game in the middle. But given the teams that they've played, the Red Wings are fighting for a playoff spot. The Wild are fighting for a playoff spot. The Flames, they look like they're ready for the offseason. But then the Canucks and the Oilers, 2 of the best teams in the league. And the fact that they have not only won all of these games, but sort of controlled large stretches of them, it's something that, look, the Avalanche's sort of underlying numbers, the possession metrics, the analytics, whatever you want to call it, they've been good all season. They've been probably somewhere in the back half of the top 10 pretty consistently for most of the season. Maybe a little bit of an uptick here or a down tick there. But these past 5 games, this is top of the league type of stuff. And I think this is whenever the Avalanche talk about the standard that they're looking for and the way that they're trying to play, I think the past handful of games is as close to the sort of the peak form that they're looking for heading into the playoffs as we've seen all year. So this is something that they've been chasing for, we're into into the 60s here in the games, and so whether or not they can continue to play like this all the way into the playoffs is another matter. But I think just the fact that they have put together this stretch of games and they know, like, hey, this is what we are at our best, is probably another positive thing for them to take from the past week. Okay, it's time for my guest for this week. I'm speaking with Pierre LeBrun. He works for TSN and The Athletic, formerly ESPN, Hockey Night in Canada, once upon a time the Canadian Press. He's one of the most connected people in hockey. Pierre, how are you doing?
You know, when you put it that way, it's like I'm running out of people to work for. But I'm good. I'm NHLG meetings in Palm Beach, Florida, day 2 of the 3-day meetings here on Tuesday. And always interesting to be down here. Even when there is no real news, it's, it's always a really good opportunity to have all the GMs in one place and chat with them. You and me both on the places to work thing. But it's funny, they never do the GM meetings in Minnesota or Boston this time of year. I don't know why that is.
Right. I think one that I went to was at Spanish Bay out in the Bay Area. That was a fun one. Or Spanish.
So that was the Board of Governors. Not
yeah, that's right.
Yeah. The owners will once in a while go out to Pebble Beach every 4 or 5 years, I'd say.
Yeah.
But normally it's in Boca, Florida, Boca Raton. Now, this year, the Board of Governors in December, you may remember, we're actually in Seattle, which is a one-time thing. A lot of the owners grumbled about it. Outpoured rain every day. But it was kind of neat. I had never been to Seattle, actually, so I found it quite neat to be there.
Yeah, it's a good. It was a good addition to the NHL circuit, that's for sure. Is there anything? Anything you said? There's not a lot of news this week, but anything of note that's going to come out of this GMEs?
Well, so far, I mean, it's only the morning of day 2. I mean, Gary Bettman won't address the media till tomorrow on the final day to wrap up things. So that's usually when there's the most juice that comes out because he's allowed to make news, unlike pretty much anyone else here. But it's been interesting so far. Day 1 was all the GMs were split up into smaller breakout groups, what they call them, breakout groups, and they were discussing different topics that could lead to change. Sometimes they just die in the cutting room floor, but sometimes they lead to change. So, for example, there was one group that discussed whether or not to minimize the e-bug and whether or not to actually loosen up the CBA so teams can have better access to a real third goalie as opposed to having an e-bug. So whether that ever sees a light of day or is just discussion for one day, we'll see. There was a discussion breakout group, of course, on player safety, on coaches' challenges, on 3-on-3 overtime, whether anything needs to be done to liven it up. So these were all smaller group discussions. And what's happening as we tape this, Corey, is that all those smaller groups are reporting back to the larger group of GMs here on Tuesday. And then they decide whether they want to go next level with any of these conversations or just say, hey, that's interesting, but no thanks.
Yeah. Well, speaking of 3-on-3 overtime, the last game that the Colorado Avalanche played was in Edmonton, and that was one of the best regular season hockey games I think I've ever covered. After the game, I was talking to Nathan McKinnon. I had said, whenever you get to my age, you've seen a lot of NHL games in person, and there aren't that many that were like, wow, that was something. And so that game was something. And I saw that you were tweeting about it during the game. So what were sort of your takeaways from that game in Edmonton?
Watching from home in Toronto, and it's interesting because you're not always sure if what you're seeing on TV is what it feels like in the ring. So it's interesting to hear your comments there. But it just felt like, to me, the fastest game I'd seen all year in the NHL, which isn't terribly surprising given the two teams involved. But then again, Edmonton and Colorado have had games where it's just a Tuesday night where one team doesn't have energy, right? I mean, you don't always have everything line up to have that kind of spectacle. And I just felt like, to me, watching from a couple of time zones away, it felt like two teams that A, brought their A game, but B, also was doing a little messaging just in case there's another repeat of the Western Conference Final from a couple of years ago. And you see that sometimes in March when Cup contenders meet. There's some, Boston swept the Leafs 2 games in a row recently. I think there's message sending at this time of year. And that's what it felt like to me, where each team wanted to drop their best that night. And it's funny, there's no such thing as a tie game anymore in the NHL, of course, because of overtime and shootout and so on. But that felt like a night where both teams felt pretty good about their game.
Yeah, for sure. I was able to catch Chris Knobloch's interview after the Avs were done, and it seemed like all the questions were directed to him were like, hey, your team can play with this team, right? And I don't know if he necessarily, I think he was like, well, we think we can play with anybody. But I do think that, like, it was just a like kind of a collaboration of things that all happened at the same time. But I think both teams were relatively rested. Both teams had just made a bunch of trades, and everybody kind of, I think that was like the first time that the Avalanche have played the 18 best skaters that they have available to them that night. Like, they played them all. Nobody. Gabe Landeskog has been hurt all year, and now Logan O'Connor's hurt too, right? So, yeah, but like the guys who were just like minor nicks or whatever, everybody was essentially healthy that they had available to them. And so, like, I saw, obviously two of the best teams. And like the thing, I think everybody was expecting like some sort of McKinnon versus McDavid, like that 8-6 game they played a couple of years ago. And this was different. This was like, it was right. This was like, there was so little ice out there. The two teams were so fast, but it was partially because they were both trying to play defense really hard, and so it just sort of like right. Like I think I said this before the game, and you and I have probably talked about this before. There are no playoff like atmospheres or playoff like games. There's regular season games and there's playoff games, but that was about as close as we've probably seen in a while, I think.
I think so, and again, when I say, it's the fastest game I've seen all year, it doesn't just mean offense. It means that you're defending at that speed. And that's what I mean, like all aspects. It just was mesmerizing to me, some of the back checks and players filling gaps and the quickness of it all. And of course, we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about the fact that how these two teams were built. I mean, you build around your core players and you build to their identity. And, the Bruins for many years around Chara and Bergeron built to their identity, right? That's a defense first team that could do it all, and that was Boston forever. But Colorado and Edmonton have, these superstar centers that can play at 100 miles an hour, but then you have to complement them with the rest of the team. And I really do think that in many ways, that's how these teams were built, thinking how can we most maximize Nate McKinnon and David, and that's what and it took a long time, especially in Edmonton's case, to I think find the right recipe for that roster wise. But I think they have, and I'd like to see them play again in a conference final, because I don't think the Oilers were really ready for prime time a couple of years ago when they played Colorado. But I think this time it would be a totally different series. I'm not saying Edmonton would win necessarily, but I think it'd be awfully close.
Yeah, I would be very surprised if it worked out the same way. So speaking of roster building, we just had the trade deadline come and go, and I mean Colorado and Edmonton were two of the more active teams. I guess just first, what now that we've had a couple weeks for it all to settle in, what was sort of your biggest takeaway from the trade deadline?
Well, I had Colorado as one of my 4 gold medal winners. I wrote a big piece the day after trade deadline, and I interviewed Chris McFarland for it, but also Kelly McCrimmon in Vegas and Kevin Cheveldayoff in Winnipeg, as well as Don Waddell in Carolina. Those were the 4 teams I thought that won deadline. And of course, the lead piece, Corey, was that you can win deadline, but it may mean nothing come playoff time. Let's be careful with all that lineage. But I did think Colorado was one of my gold medal teams at the deadline. Edmonton did fine, and at the end of the day, they may have actually had almost a perfect deadline in the sense that they addressed needs as opposed to, making big headlines. And Adam Henrique and Sam Carrick, it's given them more flexibility up front, which they needed. And don't forget, I feel like you kind of have to say when they signed Corey Perry early in the season, that's part of adding this year for them. And he's one of those playoff characters. So I think the Oilers have done a good job filling out their roster. It just wasn't quite as sexy as what the other teams I mentioned did. And certainly in Colorado's case, I think they did a bit of everything. I mean, as you know, they not only made headlines, with Casey Middlestat and Sean Walker, but they also addressed specific needs with the bottom 6 additions. And I think it was a wonderful deadline period for Chris McFarland. And wonderful in the end, because there was also frustration. I mean, he was in on Chris Tanev. In fact, the offer that he made Calgary was the identical offer that ended up going to Philadelphia for Sean Walker. So there were other attempts there, including Elias Lindholm back in January. But at the end of the day, Chris McFarland did some excellent work, I think.
Yeah, I was definitely surprised. I guess whenever some of the reporting that you and others did on on the Tanev thing. I just like Chris Tanev felt at the time. It felt like that was like a guy like, okay, they want one more really good defensive defenseman, and then when they get Sean Walker, it was like, okay, well, he was definitely not as well known 2 weeks ago as Chris Tanev, and at least around here, right? And then now that he's played a handful of games, and I mean, he was one of the, I think he was the number one star in that Edmonton game. But regardless of that, I'm already sort of, the wheels are already turning. Like, man, where did this guy come from? Is this he kind of it reminds me of like almost like Anton Strawman or one of these guys who was like in his late 20s and is suddenly like, oh yeah, everyone around the league is like, hey, this guy's really good. He just seems like he fits, with the Avs in particular.
Yeah, well, and I agree. I think he fits better because of his skating style than Tanev would have. On the other hand, Tanev is one of those playoff warrior. Everyone saw the way Vegas won the Cup last year, and I think it single-handedly, that Vegas defensive performance single-handedly boosted Chris Tanev's stock at this deadline because everyone viewed him as one of those playoff warrior D, and he is. So different players. I think either one could have been a good addition for Colorado, but I was surprised generally when I found out how hard Colorado went after Tanev that they felt they needed that on their blue line, because I kind of liked Colorado's blue line all along, but it obviously made more sense when you see the complete puzzle come together, i.e. Byram having to be dealt in a deal to get a second line center. Now it makes more sense. So I think it kind of tells you that had they gotten Tanev that early in the deadline period, I wonder how quickly Byram might have been moved in a separate deal, right? For a center. Who knows?
Yeah.
I guess we'll never know.
So I guess two of the, you mentioned like three of your four gold medal teams were in the West, and there's this like six pack of teams in the West. Maybe Nashville is surging enough that we should throw them in there too, but it does seem like those six teams in the West are, it's just gonna be a battle. The play right. So the two of the teams that you didn't mention there though were Vancouver and Dallas. Well, we talked a little bit about Dallas. Basically, my question is Dallas might have made the best trade event of anybody, right? Like Tanev is a really good player, but they only made the one. And then Vancouver got Lindholm, and that was the first big trade that kind of set everything in motion, but that was the only thing that they did. And so I'm just curious, do you think that given that Vegas and Colorado and Winnipeg all did a lot, did Dallas and Vancouver do enough to keep pace?
I think Dallas definitely did, because I think that Tanev was such a perfect fit for their needs, and in some ways, they kind of it was almost like a trade when they finally called up Logan Stangle, and you see back, that's like almost a mid-season upgrade there up front, and they definitely didn't want to block his path. So I think you have to be sensitive to that part of it. Is that, hey, we got a first-round pick who's ready to go here. So I think that's the way the Stars have looked at it, and the Stars have stayed relatively healthy of late. So, sometimes you're forced into deadline deals because of injury. And Dallas really didn't have to get into that. I think it was probably more frustrating for Vancouver. I actually sat down with Canucks GM Patrick Alvini here when I got to the gym meetings, and that piece ran Monday in The Athletic. But he admitted that, well, I shouldn't say admit, that always sounds like something criminal. He confirmed that, there were two specific targets that the Canucks were in hard on. Obviously can't name them by name, but we believe that he meant Jake Gensel and Chris Tanev. Those are the two guys that Canucks were trying to get after the Lindholm deal. In fact, when they made the Lindholm deal, they tried to have Tanev included in it, which would have been somewhat crazy. Didn't have enough assets at the time to swing that, but they stayed on it, and they were one of the four teams at the end of the day. Our understanding is that Colorado, Vancouver, and Toronto were the other finalists in on Tanev, but Dallas got him. So, but what Alvin said, though, in that interview, Corey, is that they made a point of saying if we don't get those two targets, that there's no plan B or a panic move for the sake of making a move. That's either we get one of those two guys or we don't add again. And that's what happened. They just couldn't muster up the right package for Gensel, and he went to Carolina. Yeah.
So I think, Vegas is kind of the wild card of wild cards here, depending on who gets healthy. And quite frankly, they still have to make the playoffs. This does sort of remind me of like kind of almost echoes of the 2015 Los Angeles Kings, where it was like very clear that they were one of the best teams in the league all year. except in the standings, and then they just missed the playoffs right at the very end. But so let's assume that Vegas gets healthy and they do make the playoffs. Which of those teams in the West do you like the most? I mean, I think in some ways you could probably just pick 2 of the 6 out of the hat, and that might be just as accurate as actually trying to break them down. But which 1 or 2 of those do you like the best?
Well, first of all, one of the things I find, I won't say hilarious, but fascinating, is that all year we've talked about the importance of those 3 teams battling for first place in the Central to win the Central, so they can play a wild card and avoid the other 2 Central powerhouses. But if it means playing Vegas as the wild card,
right.
I hope there is a prize here. So that in itself is a great script. But I think, I mean, I could be wrong, but I think because Vegas has been so hit hard by injuries, but I think Vegas will finish ahead of LA, which actually puts Edmonton in the crosshairs in the potential Oilers Vegas first round. My goodness. But that would be good for the winner of the Central is what I'm getting at. Whoever wins the Central. And again, LA's, they've been in a couple playoff series now. They're tough out for sure. But I think you'd rather play LA or even surging Nashville than you do Vegas if you're the winner of the Central Division. And so that's part of the script I'm following closely right now is that exact scenario is where does Vegas end up? And because that could be a brutal first round matchup for either Edmonton in the Pacific in a 2-3 or for the winner of the Central as a wildcard team.
Right.
So, yeah, I honestly, in September, I picked Edmonton to win the Cup. And I feel it is my duty as a Canadian citizen to hope that the Stanley Cup will finally land. No, I'm just kidding. I picked Edmonton because I honestly feel it's their time. But what a way to start your playoffs if it's Vegas in the first round. My goodness.
Yeah, for sure. They the one thing that I definitely picked up from Edmonton the other night is that, I mean, basically Connor McDavid's terrifying at literally every game, anytime. But the one thing that the biggest advantage they might have if they do get into a playoff series with the Avalanche is that those other centers, like you mentioned, they don't all have to play center at the same time. But having Leon Draisaitl, Ryan Nugent-Hopkins, and now Adam Henrique as well makes them pretty formidable. Gives them a chance to, and Ryan McLeod, yeah, right. So just it was fascinating to watch Knoblauch kind of mix and match those guys. They can kind of move them around and But yeah, so I give one. I guess we haven't really mentioned the other side of things, but I mean, my generic question about the East is Florida the team to beat there?
I think so. Yeah. They're my pick out of the East, and it's not just because they're have a chance to finish first or battling Boston, I guess, and the Rangers are first. But I just think they're the most complete team, and they have that. I don't know how do I describe it. They have that sort of nastiness about their. They have that moxie of them that it's just made for the playoffs, and I tell you what's an under the radar story. Sergei Bobrovsky's probably going to be a Vezina candidate. I think. I mean, here's a guy that people were saying a year and a half ago, how did the Panthers ever get out from underneath his contract? And deservedly. I mean, he had a lot of bad stretches, and then he leads his team to a Cup final, and he hasn't looked back. Like, he's been amazing all year. And listen, I think at the end of the day, Connor Hellebuyck will probably win the Vezina if I had my pick. Anyway, we don't vote on that one; the GMs do. But I think Bobrovsky might end up a finalist. And that's a story that honestly doesn't have a lot of legs. The part that he's played and where Florida is right now.
Yeah, just going based off of what we've seen in person. I mean, they've battered the Avalanche twice. Like they're the one team that in the East where they were at a different level both times. Now that's a good example of. We talked about with Edmonton where there's circumstances and context, like the Avs were tired and the Avs played their backup goalie one time. But yeah, that's the team. You sort of the Avs had a game with Boston earlier this year that was probably the closest thing we've seen to that game with Edmonton the other night, and where it was like, wow, this is next level stuff. But the 2 games against Florida have been one-way traffic, and so that's they do look like the team. They just look. I mean, honestly, like. I've talked about it with a few of the other Avalanche writers. It's like the West looks like it could be crazy, and then the East is like, well, maybe somebody will give Florida a challenge.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you pressed me, I would say Carolina, Florida in the Eastern Final. I really like how the Hurricanes line up now. with Gensel and even a rejuvenated Kuznetsov, but really their healthy blue line. That's the big thing. I mean, it's just so when Dmitry Orlov's your third pairing lefty, you're doing something right. And so their goaltending has settled. Pachekov and a healthy Freddie Anderson. I think I could easily see Carolina, Florida again.
Mm-hmm.
But the Rangers, listen, if the Rangers have had an excellent year all year too. It's just funny though. Like that's a team that I thought had a disappointing deadline. Not for lack of trying. They're in on Gensel. They're in on other things, but I don't. Is there going to be enough offense from the Rangers when it matters? That's what I want to know.
Yeah. Okay. Well, Pierre, I thank you very much for doing this. I've already taken up a little bit more of your time than I wanted to, but
good.
Anything else you want to plug from your? I saw you got a thing up with Kyle Dubas as well. Anything else you want to plug from the Athletic?
That's my latest. I sat down with Kyle Dubas yesterday, and I thought he was really, really great in the interview, just in terms of willing to share his thoughts on where this is headed with Pittsburgh and. His lines of communication with Sidney Crosby, but also really for the first time, he talked a little bit about his exit from Toronto, where he's really tried to not talk about that, as you know. And I guess at the end of the day, what he said is he explained why he hasn't wanted to comment on his dramatic exit from Toronto. So yeah, give it a read.
Okay. Yeah. Well, again, thank you so much for doing this, Pierre. I really appreciate it. And hopefully we'll, see you out here in Denver. I'll take you out for a burger or a breakfast burrito or something whenever if you're here.
Yeah, well, and I thought you were going to ask about the time that you and I covered a Washington-New York Rangers playoff series and how entertaining those 2 weeks were. But anyway,
I was gonna mention the karaoke bar in Sochi, Russia. That was also another memorable of the many memorable. Nights and playoff series and everything that we've done together. That was I was actually thinking about that when I was driving over here this morning. Like, oh yeah, I remember, like a bunch of people singing "Back in the USSR" at a karaoke bar in Sochi, Russia was a pretty good memory, to say the least. So.
That was 10 years ago, by the way.
Yeah, don't remind me.
But, all right, Corey, great to be on your podcast, buddy.
All right, yeah, thank you very much. Okay, thanks again to Pierre LeBrun for joining us on the Avalanche Inc. podcast. Next up is the week ahead. This is a weird week for the Avalanche. It's one of the last weeks of the season where there aren't a lot of games. Basically, from the time that they played in Edmonton until their next home game against the Columbus Blue Jackets, it's one game in 5 days. And they don't have another stretch like this until the last few games of the season. They have some extra off days. But they have one game at St. Louis on Tuesday night, and honestly, this is probably another spot where Jared Bednar will take the extra days. He likes to say sometimes that they play better on back-to-backs or when they're not rested. But I think that performance in Edmonton showed that they're pretty good whenever they're rested as well. So I do think that this is going to be a big week for sort of getting anyone that's a little bit nicked up here and there, getting them a little bit healthy. A couple days off, couple practice days for even more chances to sort of integrate the new guys and get them feeling comfortable. And then after that, it's an interesting run to the race to the finish, right? They will have 9 of their last 13 games at home. They're the best home team in the league so far this season. If this is going to be their chance to sort of wrap up the Central Division if they can do it. Having lots of home games is certainly going to help. So yeah, I think the biggest thing this week is kind of leads into my big question. The big question for the week is, when will Nikolai Kovalenko play, and where will he play, and how is this going to work? Which I guess is multiple questions. But Nikolai Kovalenko has arrived in North America. He was on Instagram that he landed in Denver. And obviously the team is in St. Louis now, but I imagine he is going to meet up with the team as soon as they get back. And yeah, we've got 13 games after that left, and it'll be interesting to see. First, there's been some different things about him having a minor injury. Everybody probably saw the clip of, kind of a dirty hit at the end of his last game in the KHL season. So we'll see if he can actually physically, practice and play right away, or if it's going to be a week or two or whatever it is. But he's sort of the last interesting piece between now and the playoffs. Obviously, all the other new additions have fit in seamlessly, and the team looks great right now. But adding another guy, I think he plays a pretty similar way to Yakov Trenin and Brennan Duhaime, in that he's not as big as those guys, but he's fast, he's physical. He's just kind of going to be an interesting jolt of energy. And so we'll see, whether it's at practice or, if he's going to get in a game here in the next week or two. I think that's kind of the big question for this week, at least anyway, is he healthy? Is he going to be ready to play? Jared Bednar has said if he practices and looks good, they're going to play him. And just how he fits, I think that's just going to be a fascinating thing to watch over the last month or so of the season. Next up is Down on the Farm. It's a good transition because Nikolai Kovalenko was our Down on the Farm guy in episode 1. For episode 2, it's Sean Behrens, defenseman at the University of Denver. It's a big week for DU. It's they're in the NCHC Frozen Four. They're playing St. Cloud State on Friday night, and they're possibly going to get North Dakota on Saturday if they advance. North Dakota is one of the kind of the other big national title contenders, and they've only won one time in 4 games against North Dakota this year. So Sean Behrens is an interesting prospect. He was a second-round pick in 2021. He's from Illinois. He was at the U.S. Development Program, obviously coming to play here locally for the Pioneers. He's been one that Avs fans could go see and keep tabs on. He's a junior this year. He's got 4 goals and 29 points in 38 games. I've seen him play a couple times. He's an interesting guy because he's kind of grown into be more of a defensive defenseman for DU, and he's playing next to Zeev Buium, who is probably going to be a top 10 or top 15 pick in the upcoming draft, and he's one of the best freshmen in the country, and he's very much a carry the puck, do all the offensive things. So I think it'll be interesting to see once either Zeev moves on to the NHL, or if Sean signs with the Avalanche after the season is over and gets to play, with the Eagles, probably, as I'm guessing, where he would start, just to see what. I think that one of the big question with him is like how much offensive potential is still in there, because it would be hard for him to become an NHL player or an NHL regular as just a quote unquote defensive only guy. I think there is probably a little more. Just from watching him, he makes some smart passes. He can definitely play with the puck more than he's probably being asked to this year with Denver. But if you look at the sort of where things are for the Avalanche, they have Sam Malinsky playing for the Eagles, and he looks like he might be an interesting guy as a depth guy over the next couple of years. You have Mikhail Gulyev, who's having a great season at 18 years old in Russia, but we have no idea when he might come over to North America. So Behrens is kind of an interesting, he could be kind of like the next guy up. If Malinsky moves up and plays for the Avalanche next year, then Behrens becomes the most interesting guy playing for the Eagles next year. If he signs, he could go back to Denver for his senior year as well. So at some point in the next couple of years, you could see him move from DU up to Loveland and play for the Eagles and see where it goes from there. And our last segment is the best thing that I ate this week. I spent the past week in Alberta with the Avalanche in Calgary and Edmonton, and working on a couple other stories while I was up there. But I'm going to give a shout out to a local place right before I went to Alberta. The last time I saw Sean Behrens play, actually, with DU, I stopped at Saucy's Southern Barbecue, which is right there on campus. And it was a great meal. Just some really good Southern barbecue food. Had some Cajun catfish, some green chili mac and cheese. I'm definitely a sucker for all things green chili, which has been great for moving to Denver. But if you go there before a DU game, there was lots of people in DU jerseys. There was people there in Colorado College jerseys. It was just a really fun atmosphere, fun place to check out if you're ever in that part of town. That's our episode for the week. Thanks again to our guest Pierre LeBrun of TSN and The Athletic. You can follow him on Twitter at Pierre V. LeBrun. I'm sure most of you already do. You can also follow me on Twitter and Instagram at CMasisak22. That's CMASISAK22. Thanks again for listening. Talk again soon.